Resolution authorizing a grant agreement between the Howard G. Buffett Foundation and the City of Decatur for the salary and benefit expense of a full-time DUI enforcement officer.
Motion that the resolution do pass and be adopted.
So moved.
Second.
Mr. Wrighton?
Mayor and Council, since there's been so much discussion of this, I feel compelled to say this is about safety on the streets, and it's because this Mayor and Council cares very much about people and safety on the streets. DUI, driving under the influence, and is whether it's as a result of alcohol or it's a result of prescription drugs or whether it's a result of cannabis or something else, impaired driving is impaired driving, and it makes the streets less safe. Through the generosity of the Buffett Foundation, he's agreed to provide funding for that. And I would add that after impaired driving, the second largest category for accidents and therefore additional lack of safety on the streets is distracted driving, which this does not fund. But by focus but I have challenged the chief in the year ahead to write more tickets on distracted driving because they're causing the second largest category of accidents. And so I'm cautiously optimistic that by having greater attention to impaired driving, regardless of the cost, regardless of the cause, that we can have more attention to distracted driving as well. Now, some of the folks who spoke this evening raised actually very important issues about due process and how this enforcement will work. And it is for that reason that your budget for 2020 includes funding for additional training, which the chief and his staff have wisely anticipated to try to stay ahead of what the practices are. We're not going to be doing blood draws. If there are, in the few cases where that actually occurs, it'll be likely done by health professionals. And in the absence of a field sobriety test, the law as well as practice, which we're training on, is going to be more and more geared to behavior issues. The bottom line is this isn't about pulling people over for use of cannabis. This is about maintaining safety on the streets. If driving is impaired, that reduces safety on the street, and if driving is impaired and somehow there's erratic driving, then that's the cause for a traffic pullover, not because of some of the reasons that may have been mentioned here. And to the greatest extent possible, given the fact that this is a law that's still in flux and changing, as you and others have observed, I think we're doing our level best to try to stay ahead of the best practices for trying to reduce those driving impairments, and this grant will help us to stay ahead of it, I think.
Councilman McDaniel.
If I'm not mistaken, I think some new state distracted driving laws are coming into effect January 1st, where, especially on cell phones, texting and that, where people could lose their license and that. So I'm glad the state has recognized that, and I'm sure that's come from law enforcement agencies all over this state.
Chief, I think it would be useful with Council's indulgence for you to talk a little bit about how you have thought about how we're going to train our officers to handle this different approach to dealing with impaired driving.
Mayor and Council, so this is a DUI officer. This isn't a cannabis officer. This is a DUI officer. He or she is going to do the same thing that officers are doing now. They're going to be out and patrolling the streets and identifying vehicles that are driving unsafe or violating the law, and then make those traffic stops. No different than what's happening now. We just have somebody that's dedicated to that. We had a grant years ago from the state that supported just that for several years. This is no different. We had a LAP grant through the state or through the federal government. The money was routed through the state. That is exactly the same thing as we're doing now. So there was no big deal then, being that it was from the state. We also have an IDOT grant this year that we use for speeding, for DUIs, and for seatbelt enforcement. So we do have grant money that comes in, and it's not uncommon anytime we get a grant, they want the results of those grants to make sure that the grant is supporting what it's supposed to be supporting. So nothing is different with this grant that is with others. I think everybody's hung up on the name, but the officer is going to be out focusing on driving under the impairment, not necessarily a cannabis. We wouldn't know if they were smoking cannabis till after you make the traffic stop. We don't know if they're drinking until we make the traffic stop and go up and make those observations that they're trying to do. we do know we can only base our information and what we're going to do in the future on states that actually have legal cannabis now. And when we look at those other states, they show an increase of people driving under the influence of cannabis. More accidents, when they test the drivers from these fatal accidents in these other states, they're finding that the drivers, more drivers have cannabis in their system ever since they legalized marijuana in those states. So we can only, as a police chief, I have to base my decisions based on the evidence that's out there. And right now, that's the evidence I have. So with that, we have $500,000 to put another officer on the street to make our streets safer. I don't understand what the issue is, whether it's from the Howard Buffett, from the state for the LAP grant, or from IDOT. It's a grant that's supporting making our streets safer, and I think everybody is going to benefit from that. We've had 5 fatal accidents this year. 4 of them are related to driving under the influence, and the last 2 were I want to say children 18 or under. And so that's what we need to focus on, and that's what that money's going to go for.
Any questions from council for the chief? Mr. Faber.
Thank you, Mayor. Maybe it's for the chief, and it's a budgetary consequence also. So, Mayor, several of the citizens this evening have basically asked us to reject accepting this grant. So, assuming that the council would reject this $500,000 grant, what impact would that have on the budgetary situation with the police force?
The grant is relatively recent in its offering, and so has not been included in the budget.
So I guess the point I'm raising is at some point, Chief, would you have to anyway dedicate an officer toward these responsibilities, even absent this grant and its focus?
So right now, each shift has what we call traffic officers, and they not only handle accidents, but they also handle speed enforcement and distracted driving, and they also handle the DUI. So this grant allows somebody to focus just on the DUI portion.
And additionally, it gives you more manpower that we
and
otherwise
there's another
couldn't
officer
afford.
on the streets, yes.
So by having an officer focus on the distracted driving or the DUI driving or the under the influence driving, that frees up other manpower to patrol for safety issues and crime issues within our community.
It frees them up to handle other calls for service and things that are important as well, yes.
So if the council were to reject this grant, we would be in fact delimiting or reducing the staffing or the range or the effectiveness of our police force. Would that be correct?
The way it's set up, you'd have one less officer on the streets.
Mr. Walker.
So if we didn't have this grant, would we be in a position where we couldn't monitor what's going to happen in January?
As I said, we're already doing that, and then those are spread amongst the other officers. This dedicates one officer to handle DUIs only. As I said earlier, there's several officers that are traffic officers on each shift. Mm-hmm. That's part of their duties is to be out enforcing DUIs.
Okay.
Mr. Faber.
If I may, Chief, it seems to me that I think the impetus for the criticism this evening by our citizens for this grant is the feeling that they had not been listened to originally with regard to their request for democracy and a voice in terms of the other cannabis issues, and they kind of feel that this is something that's pointed right at them who might be users of the cannabis. So they feel like first they were disregarded, and now they're being aimed at. So that seems to be, that could be, I haven't spoken with them specifically, but that's what I'm reading from their comments this evening.
Well, if that's what they're surmising, I can't control that. What I can tell you is it's a driving under the influence officer. We do not know until we make that traffic stop whether they're driving under the impairment of alcohol, prescription pills, cannabis, cocaine, heroin, LSD. We don't know that. And so this officer will be out there enforcing, making sure the roadways are safe, and they're looking for those drivers that aren't following the law and driving erratically, things like that would lead them to believe that that person is under the influence of something.
Is it true, as one of the citizens asked, Chief, that if someone had a prescription for medical cannabis and was pulled over for whatever reason was found to meet the level of 5 nanograms, that they would be cited for driving under the influence of cannabis?
I don't have the statute in front of me. However, there is a distinct difference between the Medical Marijuana Act and the most recent Cannabis and Tax Act. So whatever falls under that medical statute is what we apply.
But you can understand the citizens' concern for that category of driver and medication use of cannabis.
Even if they're on medical marijuana and have a medical card, doesn't give them a free ride to drive, Councilman Faber. There's still laws just like this new cannabis law now. It's not a free-for-all for everybody just to smoke cannabis and drive. I mean, there is stipulations in both of those laws that say when you can smoke it and when you can't smoke it. If it's legal, smoke all you want. My job is to keep the city streets safe, and that's what we're going to do with it. If the state makes it legal, then we'll allow people to smoke wherever it's legal and have as much cannabis as they want as long as it's legal. I'm worried about the safety of the streets.
And Mr. Faber, if I may, many prescription drugs tell you not to operate a motor vehicle or operate heavy machinery because it can be dangerous. And I think that's probably in line. If you are on a medication that, makes you fall asleep, you shouldn't be driving either. And that could also be grounds to be stopped, I would assume. Other comments from council? Yes, Mr. Horn.
Comment, not a question. The city of Decatur has a problem with individuals driving under the influence. In the past couple of months, we have seen 2 individuals under 21 involved in serious accidents that resulted in fatality. Decatur is consistently in the top 5 for the number of DUI arrests, even though we are the 17th most populous city in the state. So I support grant funding for a DUI enforcement officer because Decatur has a problem currently with individuals driving under the influence, and simultaneously we are reducing the number of police officers in the 2020 budget. I should point out we have over 100 stores in which individuals can buy or consume alcohol in Decatur. It is sold and people can consume it in venues both large and small, inside and outside. In addition, we have an opioid epidemic, and the use of painkillers can impair drivers. Unfortunately, the city's published rationale for accepting the grant appears to understate some of these current problems, and it appears to overstate impaired cannabis users relative to impaired alcohol users, particularly given that alcohol plays a more significant role in auto accidents. The city's published rationale again unnecessarily singles out cannabis users and ignores the fact that much of the city is considered to be disproportionately impacted by past cannabis enforcement, with higher rates of arrests, conviction, and incarceration for cannabis, along with high poverty. Moreover, black Americans are disproportionately more likely than white Americans to be arrested for cannabis-related crimes. And that, I believe, is why this rationale has raised concerns. I should point out that, again, I am in support of a police officer who spends 100% of their time on DUI enforcement because it's likely to improve public safety. I'm supportive of its grant, and it's the same rationale for why I argued for more police officers in the 2020 budget. However, again, I would point out that the rationale unnecessarily singled out cannabis users, unnecessarily reinforces potential racial differences in cannabis arrests and incarceration, and minimizes an already serious problem that the DUIs are having in our city.
Other comments from council? Mr. Horn, could you hit your mic? Thank you. Anyone else? Thank you, Chief. Anyone in the audience have a comment?